We're going to begin with Chapter 17, Designing New Terrain. This is going to be a great deep dive chapter into kind of the finale of this book to some of the more deep edits we're going to do with surfaces and creating terrain and various other ways to complement what we learned about corridors in Chapter 9. So much of this is adjacent type of design of various unique individual shapes, geometries, individual lots, stormwater management areas, certain small basins, very specific little areas we're going to design in a civil standpoint with two main tools. So mostly this chapter deals with feature lines and grading objects, and the chapter is pretty much divided starting with grading, what is it in general, and then we move into feature lines and how to create and edit them, and then we move into grading objects, how to create and edit them. So that's the basis of this chapter. Let's jump into Moodle to see where the files are. So similar, we're in Chapter 17, Designing New Terrain. Towards the end of this semester, all of our files are in here. We're going to have 5 that was supposed to be logged in, but we're going to have 5 total files and 5 completed files. So let's begin with the first file here. It is called Creating Feature Lines. I have them in a numeric order to speed up my process here, but you should have 5 files. And before we go on into this first file, learning about gradings, let's talk about gradings a little bit more. With respect to designing new terrain, I'll use those interchangeably. Mostly I'll talk about gradings, and designing new terrain is the same thing, but to speed up how I talk, I'll probably say grading a lot or grading out or various things with the word grading in it. This is very hand in hand with Chapter 4, what we learned with existing terrain, existing surfaces that are produced by, depends, this could be 3D polylines, could be feature lines, it could be points, it could be survey figures. This case, we're going to be doing something different. Those were existing features. These are going to be designed or manipulated features that are going to be built in the future, or we're designing as we want them to be built. So similar concept as Chapter 4 when we're making a surface, but we're going to be making it with many more manipulation and editing tools in some ways to conform to our desires to get intersections like this, or to get ponds later on in the chapter similar to this here. We're going to slope and grade and edit the terrain to our exact needs and wants and desires for the project to function. So that's the main difference. We are doing a little more deep editing. I would kind of call this type of surface or grading editing a little more advanced. It has a lot more you need to sometimes manipulate to get things like this intersection to conform exactly the way you want. It's very similar to Chapter 4, making an existing ground surface, but it has a lot more edits you can do to pretty it up, so to speak, to make it conform and bend exactly to the way you want it to be shown, which sometimes is one of the hardest parts. Initially creating it, one of the easier parts, editing it, getting it to look just right, say like this intersection, is the more challenging part, which I would say is definitely fit towards the end of this book in a much more, from industry experience, a much more advanced type of thing to tackle efficiently and well that a lot of people have trouble with Civil 3D when it comes to grading out sites with grading objects and feature lines. They can be very unwieldy and very customizable. Whereas when we learned earlier, and also tying back to Chapter 9 in corridors, we got cross sections and assemblies. So basically, to start over again, we had alignments, which set the horizontal more or less. We had profiles, which set the vertical more or less. And we had our assemblies, which set the cross-sectional shape all the way along our corridor. And it made our uniform shape of a road. Could be a canal, could be a railroad, but corridors have a very specific design purpose in that they're very set for uniform, very linear type designs, long uniform linear designs like what I mentioned before, like roads and canals. So they have their place. But this is where the Chapter 17 in designing using feature lines and grading objects to more thoroughly edit our surface in very unique geometries. So corridors have their purpose, but now we're going to add more to them in our design toolbox to add to them, whether it's a pond or a building pad or a tie-in with a road with existing, or maybe even this intersection. The limit is pretty high for the amount of geometries we can mix and match when we do gradings and we design new terrain. So let's go on into the book. And I won't go too far into one piece at a time. I already talked enough about what the difference is between Chapter 17, designing a surface, and our past chapters of Chapter 4, making an existing surface, and Chapter 9, making a corridor surface. But this is kind of a real quick picture to see, hey, we're making a pond with certain feature lines and grading objects that has a very uniform shape, but also a unique shape, a very customizable shape that we can make and bend to whatever we need for this pond to fit in the terrain it needs to, or the existing area or location on its site it needs to be into. So this is the contours from the top-down view we're getting used to see in Civil 3D. If I go to the next page, we're going to start talking about feature lines. Feature lines we learned about in Chapter 4 a little bit. We mostly use survey figures. So survey figures and feature lines are basically the same thing. They're both three-dimensional linear objects that can be curved and edited. They can have unique names to them in Civil 3D. They can have unique Civil 3D styles applied to them. They also populate in the prospector arrow over here in tool space. So we have feature lines that pop up here, or they can also fall under a site in here, which we'll see in a minute. But going back, feature lines are the backbone of this chapter. So they're one of the hardest things I've realized for people to learn how to edit well. There's actually a lot of little bells and whistles we won't have time to cover today, but there's lots of little ways you can edit them efficiently and effectively, and certain ways to go about editing them. I won't say every which way you can do that, but one of my most common ways is before I get a feature line set up, I will get its horizontal locations nailed before I create or edit it further, and then I will do its vertical. So generally you do your horizontal, then your vertical. They just work so much better that way. But going on into feature lines, they get a bit more complex than this, which is a little beyond the scope of this introductory chapter to understanding feature lines and understanding how to design new terrain. But feature lines interact on sites. So this picture does a quick job of explaining a split point. When two feature lines meet, they generally can share the same elevation, but it depends. We've learned about sites in the past, but they have to be on different sites if you don't want them to interact. So these ones are on the same site, so one dominant feature line will, up in the hierarchy, will pull this elevation wherever they cross. So that's a little deeper too, which types and styles of feature lines, and also corridors have feature lines in them as well. These are more your feature lines outside of corridors you can make on your own custom. There's a hierarchy of feature lines, and depending on the hierarchy that they're in your Civil 3D styles, which one will overtake the other is how this happens. And I can go into that just briefly here in a moment. But then feature line geometry, they're basically like super alignments mixed with profiles. So they have stations and elevations inside of them, and they can be edited in the Civil 3D fashions with points of intersection, which are these square grips, and also elevation only points, which are these circular grips. So those can only be edited in the vertical, whereas the square grips, like other features we've seen, can be edited in horizontal and vertical. They can move anywhere. That's an important thing to realize with feature lines before we start editing them or do anything more advanced. So I'm going to go back to a drawing real quick. And I'm just in a simple drawing I made of a curb in the city of Missoula some time ago. We have two feature lines here. And to keep it simple, they basically can be very much like a polyline or 3D polyline, but they have a lot more advanced features. When you select one, you get a big contextual ribbon of all sorts of things. You can label them and edit geometries in the horizontal and also in the vertical in this area. But the vast majority of our edits are really going to be around here in the horizontal and vertical. Beyond that, we're going to learn a little bit more on you have to apply them to a site. So these feature lines, I have them selected, both of them. They both are shown on a design site. So I have them on a design site in my prospector here, and they reside in here. I have a bunch of them on this job. They have their own given Civil 3D style, which is, this is an internal one to my company. VTOPO stands for brake line, BRKL. They also populate on a certain layer, and they have all the fixins of a alignment profile. They cannot have vertical curves though. So they're a little different in profile that way. They can't have a vertical curve in the vertical. They can only tessellate or make it little miniature straight line increments to simulate that curve. So that's one of the few things they're limited on. But they essentially have stationing along them. So when I pick on one and I open it a little further, let me pick one, and I'm just going to open my edit elevations. Excuse me, not edit elevations. You have to have these two on to show your horizontal, vertical edits, similar to our parcels, but most similar to our survey figures. So survey figures and feature lines are very similar. But anyway, I was meant to go here, elevation editor, or you can right click and go to it. And we get our panorama, which I'll bring to my screen, and we can do a bunch of deep edits. So as I go along this feature line, if I zoom out a little bit so you can see where I'm at, they each have a station. So this starts at 0 plus 0, and it goes along up station, like so. And each station has a given elevation. It's grade back, which is behind it, or it's grade ahead, which is going in front of it, where this triangle PI is. So they're like super alignments because they have elevations in stations. They're like a combination of alignments and profiles in a lot of ways. And they can get kind of complex, unwieldy. I've had a lot of issues getting them to sometimes be error-free. When they get really big, huge, with hundreds of thousands of vertices, they can be very unwieldy. So you kind of want to break your design down into smaller chunks. But this is a little forethought into what is inside of these feature lines before we edit anything. And also with this feature line here, you saw its elevations and its Civil 3D stuff inside of it. This is all just PIs. So I don't have any elevation points here, which I could add here. They're all the triangular grip, but really the blue grip, the square grip. So that means they can move in any direction. So this one's a pretty pure geometry that I used to design a curb of a little interior parking lot, but this just gives you a good idea of the start of feature lines. So let's start with exercise 17.1, which is on page 342. But just remember this too, this is a good start, introduction into a feature line, showing its PIs as the square grips and its elevation points, only elevation, not in the horizontal and circular grips. That's a very important thing to note to start with feature lines, the difference between the two. They can be manipulated far differently too as we learn. So first we're learning about creating feature lines after we've talked about grading and designing things. There's 3 ways to do it. As I go into my file creating feature lines, and we're going to have back to our 3 viewport palette here. One of them is from more AutoCAD entities in general. So from objects, RX polylines, 3D polylines. One of them is from Civil 3D objects, or I could lump them together. Corridors and alignments. If you have a corridor and alignment created, you can create a feature line directly from that. Depends on your needs. Now with versions of Civil 3D past 2018, you can make feature lines that stay dynamic to alignments and profiles. They will stay with them as your alignments and profiles changes. That might be a need you might have for whatever reasons. It's the same with corridors. But the other way is to create it from scratch with this tool. That is basically creating it from the get-go straight from Civil 3D. Depending on what you have in your drawing and your needs and your design parameters, whatever you're working with, making it from an AutoCAD object, a Civil 3D object, or purely making it from scratch in AutoCAD, depending on where you're at, any of them can work. So we'll get started on 17.1. I'm going to zoom into lot 25 here. And a lot of this is we got our road designed, our terrain, and we're going to do some working on design and these little individual building paths, how they connect to the corridor and various other things. So in this case, we're going to make our first feature lines, but from one method I mentioned from before. We'll go up here to the Home tab, Feature Line, and create feature line from corridor, right? Now, I'm always trying to remind my students and myself even, especially when I learn new commands, to anytime you're in a newer command, take a look at what it's asking you. As always before, especially if you don't know what to select first. You selected your verb, your action, now you're looking for your nouns, your items to select. So we're going to look at what we have here. And when prompted on this command line, we're going to go deeper into where lot 25 is. We're going to hover onto the corridor. We're just going to pick this. And it should turn red and show ROW right away. Let's select that. Okay. And I'm going to hit enter. So I canceled that. Let's try that one more time. But this time, let's verify I have the right site. So let's try that again. Go to feature line, create from a corridor. Let me pick this right away. So it's showing I have one selected and it's good to go. Well, I guess we're good actually. Let's just do this again, hit enter now. And let's take a look at our extract corridor feature line options. Dialog box. And let's verify it's on a site. Give me a second here. It has a certain style. So all corridors inside of them, they have feature lines with their own hierarchies. But let's set this site to lot grading. So this is going to be our individual site for our little lots. So they can play nice with each other all by themselves. And we're going to pick a feature line style, which I'm starting to drill more into this with my company's standards here and there, or other places I've been, is to get these dialed in sometimes is helpful depending on how much you use feature lines and what type of gradings you do. So let me click kind of closer to this icon. It can be a little tricky. We got to go way, we have several of them. Many of them are purely associated with corridors. These are the feature lines within corridors. They're very specific to them, and they have their own hierarchy, like I mentioned before. A lot of times you can just make basic feature lines if you don't need too much segregation or differentiation between them. But in this case, we want to pick the lot grading ROW right away. Hit OK. And let's hit extract. And it extracted it. In our book, it says OK, but that changed to extract. You should see a thick red line like this that has been extracted, or a feature line. We got our first edge where this corridor butts our lot. So we got our first building block. Now let's hit escape to clear our selection set. But before I go on with that, this is a huge tip that I wish I would have learned much earlier in my career. I made this feature line now. If I select it one more time, it's called a auto corridor feature line. It is separate from the corridor. So if I crossbox this direction, I have a few things selected. I got a parcel, I didn't really want that, but I have an auto corridor feature line in a corridor. This auto corridor feature line will automatically update whenever this corridor updates. The profile or alignment, that's huge. So maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want a manual feature line that is separate and static, not dynamic with this corridor. But in this case, this was the goal to show this. So this is a big step on page 343, is that when the corridor is modified, this feature line, because it was the nature of it is being created from the corridor, is also dynamic to that corridor. The same thing with alignments, and there's some deeper tools that keep some dynamicness between feature lines as well, but we'll start with this one. So I'll hit escape again to clear any selections set I may have had. And we're going to go back up to the Home tab and go to feature line to just create feature line from the start. And it's going to be based on the command line interface primarily once we get through this. So we're going to pick our Civil 3D site of lot grading. That's good. The book doesn't go through this much, but I will quickly, because this is very critical whenever you're creating a feature line, whether it's from an object or from scratch like I'm about to do, you can name it initially here. I usually don't go too far with this unless I have really specific ones. I might call it, maybe a feature line based on this building flat area pad. I might call it lot 25 pad. Certain specific ones I'll get specific so they can be found. For now, I'll just accept this with its number counter after it. You can change its feature line style here initially. Like any Civil 3D dynamic object, this can be done later as well after it's created if you don't like what you put it on its style. You can also tell it which layer to be on in default within Civil 3D and tool space, or in your settings within tool space. You can say which new feature lines have to stay on what layer. You can also say, I don't want this right now, I want the current layer I'm on, which unfortunately is 0, but we'll just say I'll keep it here. Or whatever you have selected, it'll pull that in. So in this case, these will be options if we created the feature line from an object, but we're creating this from scratch. So these are not objects, these are grayed out at this moment. If we create it from an object, which we will later, it gives you the option to erase the existing entity you're creating it from, which would only be overtaken by a feature line. It gives you the option to assign elevations, which we'll later see, that you can tell it to be plucked from any surface in the drawing or a very specific elevation, static, maybe just all 3000 for whatever reason, or a relative elevation to a surface plus or minus an amount. And it also gives you an option at the end to weed points. Like I said, we're creating this from new, so these aren't options, but weeding points would say, hey, I want to create this feature line that crosses all these tin lines. It'll make all these intermediary points. You might not want that, but in this case, a little above and beyond, but this is a typical dialog box when you create a feature line. We'll hit OK. Now it wants a start point, so pay attention to your command bar. And it wants us basically, we have our O-snaps on. Let's make sure we have them on. You're going to want endpoint and center and a few other things. Be careful, you can easily close out your feature line command if you mess around with certain things after your feature line creation tools is initiated here. So just be careful, you might have to restart the command. So I'm going to go to the center of the red circle in the north corner. We'll start here, get the center highlighted, the center O-snap. Okay, that's picked. When I'm prompted now, it's always looking for an elevation. After we pick our horizontal location, it's looking for the vertical. You can specify you want it plucked from a surface. And you can also, if you hit enter, whatever's in the carets, understand if you just hit enter here, that would be accepted. So you get 0, which is oftentimes what you don't want. But in this case, we're going to accept it. Just hit enter. So let's go for the next point to this west corner of lot 25, and let's get the center. So hover in there until you see the center O-snap or the endpoint, but it wants the center one. Okay. Now, in this case, the book wants us to do something I would probably do oftentimes, and we have options. We can say a slope from where we previously came from, the last point, or a specific elevation, or a difference to something we know, an elevation, or a surface. A transition I've never used. That'd be like a transition amount, but it sounds similar to difference. So I'm not sure how this one works, but surface, we'll pick that. And then it sucks in the only surface in this drawing nearby is probably the existing ground surface, but you can also go here to, if you have a wild amount of surfaces, and you could pick e.g. existing grade. We'll pick OK. And then we'll hit enter to accept that as the elevation of that second point. Now to go to the next location, we have a few options. We can say a length. We can undo the last one, or we can say arc. It wants us to pick arc. So we can start making a tangent arc. So it stays tangent, as you notice if I hover around here, from the previous feature line creation, which is good. I mean, that's generally what we want. We have a few different ways to make it. We can specify the radius, a second point to begin it, or give a line bearing. In this case, we're going to pick the second point option. It wants us to go to the top right viewport to do that, to pick somewhere nearest. This gets a little tricky to say somewhere nearest, which is basically hovers anywhere on a line or object, but not in a specific spot. So I'm just going to, I invoked that command there on the OSNAP. If you didn't see that, rewind it. And I'm going to just say somewhere in the back lot nearest here. It doesn't really say a specific spot. It just said somewhere along the back line of lot 25, whatever. I'm just going to pick there. I got kind of a crazy looking arc going there. I have 1 point and 1 point, so it's wanting to do something kind of crazy. It's basically asking for the arc endpoint. If we look here, I've actually not made too many feature lines with this kind of method, but let's pick, in this case, this corner here, the south corner of lot 25. You could also pick this. It just says south corner. This is kind of the south corner. This is the south corner. But I'm going to assume this is the southernmost corner of lot 25, which it is. I'm going to pick that endpoint. Okay. Now, once again, I picked the horizontal, wants the elevation of that location. And I don't really want this wild elevation. I don't know where that came from. I'm going to say surface again, and I'm going to accept 190. I think before I accepted the elevation of the corridor, not a big deal to get through this. So I could go back to select surface here again, but I'm going to keep it on existing grade, not the road FG corridor. And it found it. I'll hit enter to accept that, and it's still continuing on, building the feature line. So now we can continue on with arcs, or we can go back in this nature, whichever direction we want, or we can go back to line, which we're going to do. And let me select the next point. And it just says to pick the center point, which I can turn off nearest. That's kind of a bugger one. And we can get the center point, hover around this circle to the east corner of lot 25. And I would call this the easternmost corner of lot 25, even though it's kind of in the northeast. Select that, and it accepts. So this doesn't really look like the way they wanted us to do it. It is making a feature line, and it has certain elevations inside of it, one at 0. Let me give this one more go to see if I can do it a different way. Let's give this a go. Let me try. I'm doing create feature line, running through this again, hit OK. I'm just going to go to the center point here in lot 25. I'll stay in this viewport. I will say I want this surface. Yes, EG. Now I want to go to the next spot. I'm going to pick this line. We'll go here and point. I'm going to accept this as a EG surface again. That's fine. Enter. Now I'm going to pick arc. And I'm going to do second point arc. And now I'm going to go arc endpoint right there. Didn't quite like that one. So doing arcs with feature lines is kind of tricky. I could start it from here again. Let's select there, surface, EG, and try hitting arc. Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't do it this way at all. I would use the geometry here, copy it, and create a feature line really quickly from this. instead of dealing with that nuisance arc command. Let's just do that right now. So I have a parcel segment, unfortunately, but I'm going to do a copy. Copied it a few times. And now I'm going to explode. So I have a polyline. I have to delete it out later, of course. But I'm going to create a feature line from object here. I'm going to say OK. Or we can hit Control Z to undo this. A couple more times. So I got it selected. Now I'm going to create feature lines from object. I will do basic. Let's do lot grading feature line. I'll say erase existing entities. There we go. It's a little different color. That's a different style of a feature line. I just don't want to deal with those arc commands. So let me go into here and I'm going to pick my feature line and I'm going to start breaking it with this command. Go break from here to here, and I'll do break again. So I have the feature line selected. I'm using the contextual ribbon to help me find it. Here is my horizontal editing tools. Here are my vertical ones. We'll talk more about those. And I'll break and break. I'll delete that feature line out. Let's just say if I just wanted this one pad. And now I'll grab my feature line here and I will join with this feature line. There we go. I have a lot better feature line that wasn't going all over the place trying to follow their zany pattern on that. You can continue editing it and add more vertices and join them later with this final one, which I'm actually just going to do with this method. Let's try this. Feature line from objects, which I don't think you can do with a parcel. Nope. So let's just draw another one. Create feature line fresh. We'll accept that. Accept this, and this is fine on layers. Let's start it here. Let's hit surface. E.g. accept that. And let's go to the center point of this corner. Let's accept this elevation. We can hit surface if you don't like what you see. Enter. So feature lines can be very unwieldy. They're not the funnest. You get better with them. There's a lot of ways to go about the same operations. None of them are always right or wrong. I think they had the right intent to try to put an arc in there, but whatever their instructions were, I think the order was just all over the place. And I'm going to join this one. So I got my feature lines there on all three sides, and I have my feature line here, the auto corridor feature line that stays live. Let's do our last one here to end this section. We'll go to feature line, create feature lines from objects. And when I'm prompted to select an object, it could be a line or polyline or a 3D polyline to convert to a feature line, I'm going to pick this rectangle. This is the building pad. We're going to hit enter. Now we're going to get the create feature line dialog box. Let's check the box next to style, make sure, or site. That's good. And the style is good too. It's on lot grading. We can leave this as it deletes the old polyline and overtakes it with the feature line only. And we'll talk more about these later. You can assign elevations to it ahead of time. Hit OK. There its feature line comes up, which is in this style, this thicker blue line. And if I hover crossbox in the negative direction this way, I just have one feature line. So if I would have not selected erase existing entities, I'd have a feature line and a polyline there. And it's located at elevation 0. So if I hover on these like this, pay attention to down here. So watch this as I go up here and hover. So I go click that, the new feature line, I have 0 down there. So that's one quick way. A lot of times I'll move around. See, it's moving in the XY down here. My coordinates, if you don't have that open, go to the hamburger box, pull down and turn it on here, coordinates. I use this all the time for just quick spot checks. And pick on that, look at that. You can also right click and go to elevation editor and you notice everything's on 0. So we don't have that going on yet, but that's good enough for now. Let's go to the second part of this chapter, editing feature lines. So we got a little bit more of them going on here. I kind of see what was meant to be done here, and we got the same effect. We got all three sides of this lot, the lot lines, feature lines to grade off of. We got the building pad, and we have our auto feature line from the corridor here. So going into the book again, we have a bunch of editing feature line tools, which is very similar to what we've seen for editing parcels and survey figures. And there's a bunch of them. We'll go through them real quick, but inserting and deleting PIs are your biggest ones, your points of intersection. You can add and delete. They're very similar to AutoCAD commands, but AutoCAD commands don't work on feature lines. They don't recognize them. They're too advanced. They had to program this as separate. We have a break command, which is similar to AutoCAD. You can break a feature line. You can trim them based on an object or fence that you trim about. You can join them together to combine them to make them one, which I use all the time. I use almost all these all the time. You can reverse a feature line, the direction, because remember they have stations inside of them. You can reverse the direction of the stationing depending on what you want. Oftentimes that's not that relevant, but it can have its purpose. You can edit a curve to basically change the radius of a curve, or you can delete out a curve with hitting the delete prompt before you go any further. You can add a fillet, which is where a PI is, where there's no curve. Basically, you can add a curve with a radius. You can add a fit curve and a smooth curve. And there's even more options. I'm in Civil 3D 2022, but it's very similar still for 5-6 years ago. Fit curve it makes a series of line segments in an arc segments, and it simplifies a feature line that has way too many points inside of it, PIs with an arc, for example, or arc and a curve. It's a little different. You can control where the curves are created, unlike the smooth command where you can as much, but the curves that you make are static. So once they're moved, they don't maintain their tangency. Whereas smooth curves, they replace PIs with curves, but it's a little different than the fit curve. So it creates curves for the entire feature line. So not just a one little part. The fit curve, you can add over like 20 spots inside of a feature line, for example, and round a corner where there's a curve maybe, but it's still static. A smooth curve is it keeps dynamic, but it wants to curve the entire feature line. But it will keep dynamic, so everything will stay tangent, and it adds like little splines. This one I don't always love, but if it worked a little better if smooth worked for specific areas, it would be the ultimate. But fit curve usually is when I want to have like survey data and a bunch of tessellations or lines going around a round object. I will round them in that spot to show a round curve. That's a perfect example. Weeding, it takes out points out of feature lines, weeds them, pulls them out, pulls out data. I use that a lot, especially when extracting feature lines from big surfaces. Stepped offset, that is making a feature line with respect in parallel to another feature line. It's like the offset command in AutoCAD, but it applies a vertical aspect as well. So X, Y, and Z. And also could be called, if you typed it into the command line, offset feature. So you can do this with 3D polylines as well, but you have to type in offset feature. But this should, I believe, work with 3D polylines as well. So let's start editing some feature lines with these geometry commands. We're going to go to this feature line by pad 26. I'm going to pick it. And I'm going to go to my contextual ribbon, and I have feature line options. I'm going to say insert point of intersection, and it wants us in this case to go to the little circle here to the center. Make sure you have your center object snap going. Click that. And when prompted for an elevation, you can either click surface to verify. This should be correct because it's the only surface we have out here is this existing ground surface, so it has to be pulling data from something, but we can verify that. We can hit surface. We can click this again, one further in the matrix, select surface. Let's verify that the existing grade is selected. Yes. And we'll accept that. We'll hit enter. Now the command's still live and open. So PIs, we always want to go to our horizontal spot, then it asks for the vertical. So horizontal, then vertical usually. This next point, let's snap to the center of this circle. It's a little close to this green line, a little awkward. So hover near the circle and it will go to the center snap like that. And now when prompted for an elevation, it should have found it. This should be correct. Let's just hit enter because I know that's correct at this point. But if you want to go through that again, go surface, select surface to make sure it is. Hit enter. So we've added two PIs. We're going to talk about a missing curve now. So let's hit escape a couple times to clear this command out and go back to nothing in our selection set, but just the feature line. And when the feature line is selected, keep in mind your contextual ribbons, like we've been learning all semester, come up with all the awesome options you can use with the feature lines and grading objects and editing and groups and styles, adding them to surfaces and various all kinds of things here. So no different, just slightly different palette of options than we're used to seeing, feature lines. So let's pick now, with the feature line selected, let's go to the one I was saying I like a lot, the fit curve option. We even have a couple new options in 2022. This one is called insert points at crossing locations. Wherever there's crossing feature lines, a PI, a physical node is set there, which is actually a really handy command. But other than that, they haven't changed much in this department. The edit elevations have changed a little bit more. But let's pick fit curve. Pick it. Now on these ones, really pay attention to your command for your options. And let's do points. So let's pick points. It wants us to pick a start. And the start point, let's try to pick the center of this blue circle. I'm going to hold shift and right click and get just center for this object snap just for one operation. Center. Hover in there. A little closer. There you go. And wants to pick the endpoint. And use the center snap to hover to the center of, let's hold shift, right click again, center for one operation. There we go. You got to be very surgical on picking the centers of both of these. It fit the curve between these two exact points. That was good. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes you got to specify a radius. That's more for the fillet command. You specify the radius. This one fits between two given points. So I often will do that if I have 5 to 10 vertices in here. I want to smooth right through all of them on a curve or on a curb line. I'll do that. This was just between two. You need at least minimum 2. So the next operation we're going to do is we're going to break the feature line for lot 25 here, and then we're going to join it to the feature line in lot 26. So let me hit escape a couple times to clear that selection set, and let's bob out of here. Okay. Basically, click any feature line in the drawing to get your contextual ribbon up. So let's pick this one again, which is of the basic feature line style. As you see, it's a little different than the lot grading style. Like anything in Civil 3, if you hover on it like this, you can see what layer and style it is in what Civil 3D objects. So it's a feature line on lot grading style of the layer C topo feature. So I got them back to this. feature line selected, and my contextual ribbon comes up, and we're going to some more edit geometry commands of feature lines. Let's go to the break command. And I want to select the blue perimeter now. So I want to select, I originally selected this one, yeah, but I want to break this object, this feature line. So let's pick this. This one's good. I like to sometimes break at one single point, so it literally doesn't break out anything. So if I picked one point twice, I would have a break with zero distance, which can be nice. And I mean, essentially that's what we want to do here. So I'm going to pick first point to get that. It's kind of confusing option. This is a confusing command, but I've done this a bunch. So basically I invoke the first breakpoint. So where I think I want to join this blue to this green, that's the key to where we break it. So we'll see what that means in a second. I'm going to pick this spot at this endpoint once, and the same exact spot with the data click again twice. So it broke it in one singular spot, one instance, and that's what we want. So now if I hit escape, I have two separate feature lines that look like they're ready to be joined. Basically, I broke the feature line without creating a gap. That's really what I was trying to say, which they explain and which is exactly what I wanted to do. Nothing really changed a lot more than I just have two blue feature lines where I used to have one. So let's just click one of the feature lines. This one's fine, just one of them. And let's go now to the join command, which is up here, or that's the trim, excuse me, joins right next to it with this icon. So this one joins whichever one you first selected, it overtakes the second one you select. So I'm going to click the green feature line, and it overtook it because it's becoming part of that first selected blue feature line of the lot grading style. So those two lines are now connected into one singular feature line. If I hit escape and zoom out, they're all one big line. That's something you do all the time with grading too. You got to get really customized and contain and manipulate these in really custom ways. So going on to the third part of this chapter, 17, we got more of our pad feature lines connected with our corridor. We're getting them customized. Let's kind of, this is a good order of operations, really. A lot of, when we're editing feature lines, being they're so custom and we can manipulate them very custom like polylines, we oftentimes move them in the horizontal first, get them where we want to, dial them in. Maybe we even get some of the elevations somewhat correct as best we can. Then generally, the best order of operations is to dial in our elevations after that. Now we're going to learn more about our elevation editing commands. So our elevation editor is a vista, much like all the panoramas and vistas we've been seeing that gets really surgical in a tabular format. We have insert elevation point, which you can create one or many elevation points on a feature line of exact increments and various things, which is very handy if you're trying to make some data to build a good break line. We can also delete them in the same fashion. This is probably my most common used tool is a quick elevation edit that lets us change grades and elevations in a prompt fashion. We have edit elevations, which only lets us edit elevations. We have set grade between at least 2 points or many hundreds of points. It lets us set an exact grade in a slope or a grade percentage format. These are our most common used tools right here, I would say for sure. And we get some more deep ones that I've used a few times. They're hard to explain by talking too much, but generally this one, you pick a start and end point, and then you say which grade I want going this way, which grade I want going that way, and it finds the horizontal location to make that work, depending on your starting and ending elevations. So it picks an exact point. It's a little hard to explain without showing you a little deeper. I will in a sec. Raise and lower by reference basically adjusts all of the elevations of one single feature line simultaneously with a selected reference point that it gets from another feature line showing a difference in elevation. It changes the entire other feature line. This one and this one are very similar. grade extension by reference, set elevation by reference. This is a way to grade between feature lines that aren't exactly touching, or there's a gap between them, and you want to get a certain grade right, but it only edits a single feature line, or a single point on the feature line elevation-wise. So you set one good point based on another, and then you work your way back from there. This one's very similar to this one. It uses a reference, but it only does a smaller area, not the entire feature line. This one is a great tool to grab elevations from an entire surface and apply them to a feature line and options you're choosing. And then this one is pretty self-explanatory too, like this one from surface. It raises and lowers an entire feature line, all elevations of it simultaneously at once, up or down. Pretty straightforward, that one. So going into some of these tools, if I go to my feature lines here, this isn't built on a surface yet, but to quickly show these a lot more surgically, we have our horizontal stuff. Let's pretend that's all set. We're going into vertical. So we go to elevation editor. We have all of our elevations across this bad boy. And we can see our stations. It's going up. As we go across this, you can see them highlighting. I'll hit escape so you can see them better. We're going up and down in the stationing as it goes up and down here. We have elevations at each point. So that's our deep tabular editing. And every point, you've got a grade back, upstream, and a grade ahead, downstream. And you also have a station and an elevation. So four entities, and between 2 points creates a length, right? So there's certain things you can edit in this fashion too as well. You can apply things here. You can pick certain chunks and say, hey, I'm going to do shift right click or shift or control. There we go. You might change these all to the same elevation all at once. So I grabbed all these and changed them all to 3189 all at once. There's reasons to use this tabular format. You might grab a few of them and just change them a set amount over a chunk of the feature line. With this, set an increment, and you go up or down a foot, up or down. Or you can use this to flatten it and say, hey, I want these to be a constant elevation or a constant grade, 0, 0, 0, 2, 2, 2 in one direction, 2% over that particular area. This is new to 2018. You can specify very specific zones or all points on a feature line and say, I want everything to match this other surface I just brought in. And that is pretty cool. So you can also have the elevations just say absolute. So it's all these elevations I just changed. Well, I missed some of them. These are all holding to me just changing to this existing ground. They just all set. Or you can say relative. So these are all absolute. Only politicians deal in absolute, at least in the United States, voting for one side or the other, but we're going to be relative here. And we're going to change one of them to relative. Didn't like that. But if I go back up here, let's just change this to relative. It won't allow us. I won't spend too much time on this, but you can turn these on and off. This one is not participating as well as I thought it would, as well as this surface over here was. You can tell it to stay absolute to whatever surface you grabbed it from, or to go relative plus or minus from that surface. But we'll get out of this elevation editor for now. We'll go back here to our feature lines of this curb I did some time ago. And this is the big heavy hitter. This one, this quick elevation edit, you can quickly edit just these single spots or the grades. I always pay attention to which direction you're going. So this one's all over the place, but if I go up in that way, I can edit this. If I pick it, I can edit that slope and uphill, say 5% instead of 4.445. There, it's changed. Or it's in this way, it's downhill. So downhill is always designated by the negative. You can edit just one grade and one elevation at a time as you go, get really nitpicky. There's other tools like we were showing. This one just does elevations. So I'm only editing one elevation at a time. This one here is really handy. It sets grade between two picks. So let me say I want to set from here, and then specify the endpoint. I want to set the grade all the way to here, for example. Enter. Let's try that one more time. Pick the grade, select there to the start point, specify the elevation is, that's okay for now. Well, let's go to all the way to here. And it says that is the default grade. If you went straight grade across all these, it's negative almost 4. I'll accept that just for purposes of instruction. And well, let's check it with my quick checker. You can see that it did that all the way down the line, that grade. So a lot of tools here. Just a couple more. I don't want to go through all of them, but this high-low one, this one's the same, but it does it on multiple feature lines that have a common point, similar to the one I just did, and it straight grades them in the similar fashion. It's a newer tool for newer versions of Civil 3D 2020 plus. I'm going to insert a high and low elevation point here. So this one, you pick 2 points basically. So let's just pick here and here. So I'm going to say this is my start point, this is my end point. So my grade ahead, this direction, let's just say is 6% or negative 6%. And my grade going back, we'll say is negative 4%. It picks the exact spot where that would have to be in the horizontal, depending on whatever my elevation was here and here. They're probably different most times. It says to go negative 4 and to go negative 6. This is where you would need to be, and it creates it. So that one's pretty cool to create high and low points in between two entities. So now you can see it goes down 4, down 6, but this is the key, that it knows how to find this exact point. Now you can see these are elevation points, so these can't be moved like this. They can only be moved along the line, the feature line. Unlike the PIs that are the square grips, they can be moved in any direction in the XY. So that's just a quick tutorial on that. Now let's go through just a couple more of my favorites. This one and this one have a lot in common, but the old straight grade, an old school engineer method I call it, is to say, oh, I want this to grade to here at 2%, and they'll just do a straight grade. Well, there's a lot more work to do in between and everything else setting grades, but this is a good way to start. You say, hey, set elevation by reference. I say, okay, let me pick this point. My elevation is that. I'll hit enter. Let me restart that command again. It got off on the wrong foot. Pick my feature line. I'm going to straight grade across. And this is only setting one elevation. So pick this, but this is my main reference. I know I have this set. This is golden. Let's just pretend. And let me turn my ortho off, my F8. Well, that turns my prompter off too. Let me turn that off. So as I go across, it makes a temporary yellow line. It's saying, hey, all the way across here, I have an elevation meeting here. The grade is negative 4 currently, and the horizontal distance is almost 78 feet, as you can see in my dynamic prompt. Well, let's just click this here. Let's say I know I want that to slope all the way across this whole parking lot, negative 2.5%, something more manageable maybe, let's say. It changed this one elevation right here based on this one. And now I can do a straight grade and say, okay, I want a straight grade from here to here. What is this now? And it changes it to, it's an uphill slope of 1.63. Quite a bit going on. but there's a lot of little tools to manipulate between feature lines. This last one I'll show you is something I do. I might want to check the grade between this gap here. It's kind of hard to do without a feature line here with my quick tool. So I'll use this. I'll pick grade extension by reference. I'll pick this line. I want that. Yep. Enter. I'll pick this line. I want that straight one. Let me try it one more time. Don't want that one. I want the straight. Yep. It usually lets a grade go across these. Let me try a different one. So you got to be kind of careful how you pick. Let me just pick. I don't necessarily want that, but let's say I want to check the grade across these curb islands. That's fine for examples. I just want to check what is that numerically. I pick it, it's like 110. Let's just say I don't want that. I just want -2 grade. And if I check these with my quick editor now, 3189 and 3188.54, that seems like about 2%. So I fixed that. I made this go down 2% across with an extension. So that one's handy. The last examples, I have a bunch of feature lines here I made on a surface and did a big grading with. Let's say I want to grab some here. Let's pick this one, for example, that I connected with the existing sidewalk and gave it some PIs and such. Let's say I have a feature line and I want to raise or lower it all in one fell swoop. I will use this icon here. Pick this. I'll say I want to raise or lower it. Okay, we'll leave it alone. Or I will potentially say I have this feature line made, but I want to pluck all the elevations from the surface. And we'll say that's fine. I'll accept the existing surface as the one I choose here. I'm going to pick, in this case, to insert an intermediate grade break point. So basically, anywhere where there's a tin line crossing this feature line, it will populate a round PI point at least. So I'll hit OK. It will give that surface elevations, which I've already kind of done, but those are the main commands. So let's go back to 17.3 and get rocking here. It's called editing feature line elevations. So we've created them, learned a few ways, 3 ways to create them, how to edit their geometry in the horizontal. Now you saw a whole bunch of methods. I showed you quickly how to edit them in the vertical. This is honestly getting pretty advanced in the Civil 3D. A lot of people don't do this kind of manipulation, but this is a more deep, if you're going to be a designer or a drafter or someone manipulating terrain, these are pretty essential things to learn with Civil 3D towards the end of your skills. So basically, let's start up in here. I'll pick any feature line. So we're just going to look here on our contextual ribbon and make sure these two are on if they're not already. So if they're off, you won't see your horizontal vertical editing tools here. Let's turn horizontal, geometry, and our vertical or elevations, make sure those are on. We'll go back to some more basic ones. And let's go to the quick elevation edit. This is the one you really want to start to learn with for sure for editing in the elevation sense. And let's go to, I don't know if it matters right off the top of our head, but let's go over the north corner of lot 25. So let's pick this one. And if we hover on there, you can see my triangle is like kind of gray. That means it is connected and tied to that red feature line. That means we can't edit it. Okay, so it is almost like a static. Until we move it off that node, that's what the gray means. So we'll go back to that. Let's go to the other corners and just note the elevations. Let's hover on them. So this is what 190.06. This one, the grade shoots down at a direction barely. It's almost flat. almost less than a 0.5%. It goes up, downhill this way, uphill this way. So always mind the direction you're grading arrow. Here's your elevation of 190.45. It's pretty flat. We go this way, and this is gray, like I said, because it's connected to the corridor feature line. So it goes downhill this way a little bit. So our high points over here. Let's hit escape a couple times. And that's like the book was getting at, and this is pretty common. A contractor probably would flatten out a very flattish pad area to start building on, to start bringing materials on, to start manipulating the ground from there to do work on. Or possibly a higher pad here to keep positive drainage. So it's the highest spot on the adjacent area is the home. There's a lot of little things that go into here, drainage and where ditches are and other existing features. And the road, of course, is a big design constraint, which it ties into. This driveway would have to float between this building pad elevation and the corridor. That would be another thing to keep in mind. Essentially, this is a building pad, so it's going to be relatively flat until it gets built on and drained out to certain design parameters. And one of the key things of a building pad is setting a really good elevation of maybe where the foundation starts to be built on, or later if you add from the ground up, that would correspond to a finished floor elevation. So setting some of the critical building pad elevations is one of the huge, bigger things that dictate grading design for things like land development here. So we had our lot corner over here, which was, this one was at 190 and some change. This building pad, actually this one was a little higher, 190.45, as you saw here in the coordinates. So this building pad might be just a bit higher than its highest corner, okay? So it's the highest point. That might be one starting point you would go to and then go from there. Let's hit escape a couple times to clear your selection set again. So this one's going to be a little trickier. I'm setting an elevation by a reference, similar to how I did when I was showing you some of these elevation editing tools previously. So if I pick one, these tools here on my feature line contextual ribbon that opens, let's give this a go. So definitely gets tricky by the time we go to step 5 through 12, 5 through 11. So let's try it. And there's a couple ways you could do it, but let's start by picking the lot 25 feature line, and let's look at our ribbon, and let's use our raise and lower a feature line by reference. Pick that. Now this part's a little tricky, so just bear with me. Go to the southern corner of lot 25 here, but don't click the mouse. Just hover on it so it's showing the endpoint and start hitting tab. Now, watch how different things are highlighting. The back lot, another line, my line in the middle here, which goes to 190.45, some change. That's what we want. So keep tabbing around. Look back here, okay? This is what it's wanting you to look at the coordinates. If you don't have it, turn on your coordinates through your hamburger button. But let's hover here. Keep hitting tab until you see that 194.45, okay? Do it one more time. All right. Now, since I have that point selected, left click. It'll draw a temporary reference between the two of a grade, but I want to specify this point here. Let me turn on my endpoint snap again, or you can go to your OSnaps there. Make sure I go to this endpoint, pick that. Now specify a grade. We're going to type 2, and uphill 2% is basically what this means. Hit 2 there, okay? Hit enter. So if you watch this viewport here in the lower right, a feature line move upward to join the perimeter feature line. So there's a little bit of action going on here. This feature line went from elevation 0 and shot right up in here to a correct elevation. So this 3D can help you look at this correctly. So these lines, these feature lines are now getting graded out. If we hover on some of these, if we use our quick elevation edit, we can see it edited them relatively to each other. They're all elevation 0. So this raised them basically 2% from here to here. Using this as the reference, relative elevation, and then this is the set point, the grade to make it. And it got all 4 points. As you can see, the same elevation. So that's pretty cool, but a more advanced tool for sure. Let's hit escape to clear the selection set once again. Let's pick the feature line that represents the rear of the lots here. And then we're going to use yet another elevation tool. This one's fairly easy compared to the last one. We're going to say elevations from surface. Like that. And now we have a few options. We're going to make sure that EG is indeed the surface that's selected in the box. But next, we're going to say, yes, we want to insert intermediate grade break points. This basically will, every time, I don't have the EG tin surface on right now, but every time in the background that there's, remember our surfaces have points and lines, which are the tin lines, and that form the contours. So every time there's one of those tin lines that crosses this, it's kind of hard to explain without it on, that's where it will form a little intermediate grade break where that crossing is with this feature line. Hit OK. So on the command line here, we can select multiple feature lines to retain the elevations from the existing ground surface, or we're going to do partial. So we hit partial. And let's pick this rear feature line again. It was picked. It didn't look like it was, but I can assure you it was, because now it says specify the start point. So let me pick here, and let me pick the end point, which is good to see it's going along, end point there. It grabbed just partially along the feature line for this segment only. So it only grabbed elevations just for this partial spot, which is pretty cool. It didn't grab them for these lines as well, because these are going to be more controlled by our design, which ties in with the corridor. So let me hit enter. This feature line just sucked in the elevations from the existing ground all along here with a lot of crossing break lines. So, or tin lines, let's take a look at that. They're basically additional elevation points. So let's look at that a little deeper, because they don't do too good job of explaining that fully. It is a little confusing. Let's go to, we're just going to change the existing ground surface quickly here to something with triangles showing in the Civil 3D surface style. Let's give it a second. So anywhere there was a significant grade change, it added contours or circles, but it also for sure added one on every tin triangle where the existing ground surface crossed a tin triangle. It got those for sure, and it added some more even. But it definitely does those plus more, depending on also the variability of your surface, how much it's gradient, how much it changes. So I just turned on the existing ground surface to kind of show you that is what it sampled. So this feature line that we just made with all these points of intersection and these elevation points sampled this surface. We'll move into grading objects now, to the fourth part of this chapter. So this chapter is primarily concerned with two main ways to design new terrain: feature lines and now grading objects. Grading objects are kind of like more advanced in some ways. Feature lines, they have criterias, and they have to belong to a group, and they have to be in a certain part of our sites to work. So some reason why would you use them? For example, you might have a well-built feature line of a building pad, for example, and you want to grade up or down to a certain amount, whether it's a relative elevation or down to a surface, and the grading object will do that based on a criteria in a certain amount of grade. It will grade off of your feature line as its baseline. Basically, it uses the feature line as a baseline to grade off of. So the picture on 253 is a good example of making a pond, or excuse me, 353. You're basically making a grading object saying, hey, this has to go this distance at this slope. You're forcing it to. You can also make feature lines that way too. Looks like they probably graded this to a fill scenario down to the existing earth all along the edge of the pond. They built it up like a big berm. And a little bit of a cut scenario here where it cuts into the existing earth. So the grading objects have certain criteria inside them, and there are a collection of feature lines inside of them. Not really that important to go beyond that, but the feature lines inside of them move dynamically as one object. But they depend on a feature line to be built off of. The feature line is basically their baseline. So essentially, grading objects need to be made off of feature lines. And they provide more dynamicness than maybe a feature line does in some ways, depending on which criteria we use. Similar, to corridors, we can do them over certain areas or regions of feature lines. Note that when you make them off of a feature line, let's say you grade to this surface, this is an existing surface, you will no longer be able to edit this feature line in every way you want. You won't be able to join it, add more certain vertices, or add certain types of geometry to it. You'll have to regrade it again. So that's a constraint. Usually do your grading when your feature lines are pretty dialed in, I would say. But feature lines and grading objects together can help you make a really robust and unique looking design surface like this mounded up retention or detention pond here. Generally, the grading objects have certain parameters, and there's 4 different grading criteria that come with Civil 3D, but it's usually something like slope, distance, and elevation. And we'll add a 4th one called relative elevation, which decides which way it goes up or down. So going into grading criterias, they're not very well understood oftentimes. There's the 4 of them that come in Civil 3D, and there are different criterias inside of this dialog box that, you might have a curb, like in this one, and you have a steep slope that, for example, you go up a short distance, and you make a top back a curb from a front a curb, or you make a pond slopes like this to make a pond edge. So, for example, you would use a certain slope or distance to do that, and you put exact criteria in here to do that. And grading groups have to be created, or criteria and gradings have to be created within a group. So they're a little collection of many gradings. You can have 1 or hundreds. This enables you to make them under them. Grading groups go under sites. This is the initial grading objects creation toolbar that brings you to these options here inside of the grading criteria. And they have to stay inside of sites. So just like parcels, they don't have a choice. They have to be on sites. Feature lines and alignments can be on site none or no sites, but grading objects and parcels have to be on sites. So let me show you something I did for a top back a curb in a Missoula job here, really quick. So here's the job quickly. In the grand scheme, I made a huge parking lot tied to a big amount of existing sidewalk all the way around here. And if I go back to this simplified file, I have a bunch of feature lines I made. And keep in mind, this surface that I have established is very exaggerated. It's 0.2 to 1 foot contours to really show it. It's fairly flat, but I have a low point here, draining into here, low point, sumps here, low points. I have a lot of entrances on various sides of this site. Another low point here that drains into here, drainage this way. But beyond that, I have a pile of feature lines I put on a certain style here, and they're mostly just on V-topo break line. I have them named a certain thing, and they're on their given layer. If I right click and say select similar, I have about 144 of them, so quite a few. And a lot of them I graded out the front of the curbs first, okay? So I have them very set horizontally and vertically, which took some time. But for example, this curb I set up and I made the front of the curb static, a feature line here, it's selected. And then from there, I made a grading object here, which is this. So it's a grading. It's just on this style here, which is, I didn't make too many different styles in its own layer. I graded This is a catch or a spill curve, depending if its nose points up or down. I said I want to grade to this distance at this amount of grade, 2 feet. So I made the top back curve really quickly once I have the toe made, and I made this all the way along all these curb islands. And basically, whenever I manipulate one feature line, the grading object moves with it. So I added a level of dynamicness to a good majority of my design here for this uniquely shaped parking lot. All these grading objects connected to my feature lines here. If I select them, they are all based off of my feature line, which is right here. So this is my baseline, and this grading object was made for this curb in this instance off of this baseline feature line in many spots. So that's one application I just did recently to drastically speed up my production of this unique geometry of this parking lot. I did that on all curbs. So going back to 17.4, let's learn a little bit more about grading objects. And they can be displayed in their own unique way with Civil 3D styles. A lot of places don't do too much with them, but they also have styles as well as feature lines. So that previous pawn we looked at, generally those would get a lot of times utilize grading criteria and grading tools to make them. A lot of times for retention ponds or detention ponds. So basically just ponds for stormwater drainage that are designed in different ways. They're like sumps to hold excess stormwater of a site. After a post-land development, we have a lot of impervious surface. All this water needs to go somewhere. It can't drain into asphalt and concrete. So it generally promotes the development of these ponds and other drainage structures to retain for a while and release, or detain permanently in these ponds that were built by grading objects. So going back to page 355, we're going to get on with the grading object learning for chapter 17. So basically, in this whole example, we're going to use grading objects to build a model of a pond. We're going to start with the green feature line that we have, which basically represents the top inside edge of pond. We're going to build it from there using grading objects to help mitigate a bunch more of our new stormwater runoff we're going to have from overdeveloping this land with impervious structures and buildings. So let's start by going to a new area. We'll go to the Home tab and go to Grading. One second while CAD loads up. Go to Grading here, and we're going to go to Grading Creation Tools to get our first dialog, our ribbon or toolbar. We'll learn a little bit about grading infill. Grading infill helps us to create a grading inside basically an area bounded by feature lines or lot lines also, and it gets converted into an infill grading, so the contours suck into that area. But for now, let's go to Grading Creation Tools. And first we're going to set the grading group. And we're going to go to the site called Pond. Pick that. We'll hit OK. You have to pick a site for it, for the grading group to go to. And now we have our Create Grading Group Creation tool, our group dialog box now pops up. This will make its own standalone surface of a certain style. These tessellations this is in how often in the XY, and this is this is basically how much it does to round the edges of the grading. So how close to a circle it can make it in form, and the angles, the smaller the angle, the tighter to a circle it gets, and the same with spacing. So this helps define how rounded in some ways a grading is at its corners. Now at this point, let's just hit OK to accept this. Mainly you're going to verify that this stuff is turned on. Doesn't say anything about a volume-based surface, so if you're going to do volume comparisons, one surface to another, which one has the volume between them, oftentimes your existing ground, your base surface that you build off of, is your base surface, because that's what you're basing your comparisons to, is what you start with. But let's just go with what they say on this and say okay. And we'll also hit OK to dismiss the create surface for now dialog box. We're not too worried about that or naming it anything special. And now we have our main grading criterion. So these are our 4 ones that come with Civil 3D. You really don't need any more than this. You can make custom ones that basically skip a couple steps for you. Basically these steps here are all the steps. You pick what you want to target, how it projects out, is it cut fill, at what angle, which is slope and grade. They're the same thing. Slope is in a ratio, so horizontal to vertical, and grade is in percentage. That's the biggest difference between slope and grade. They do similar things, just different math symbology. One's in ratio, one's in percentage. And generally, this one I'll leave as use average slope, but since we have one picked, it's doing this for us. But in this case, we're going to pick grade to relative elevation, and different options will come up. You can't cut and fill because you got to pick one direction relative, up or down. Now when you pick graded distance, it says similar thing, but you have to go a distance. So the distance is the primary factor, and then you pick what percentage, what angle. When you grade to surface, which I often do, you're doing a grading from a baseline, this feature line probably in this case, out to some surface, and it will cut or fill automatically, and you choose at what aggressive of a slope to do it at in the cut or fill projection, cut being up direction, fill being the down direction. It fills or embankment to the existing earth, and cut being cut to the existing earth or excess material. Embankment is another word for fill. The cut slope side and the fill slope side are very common terms in road design and civil design. So let's go back to grade to relative elevation. And now we have to go to create grading here at this point. So we're not going to create a transition or infill or copy, create a grading. We're going to create a grading. And now this gets a little deep. This is why it's towards the end of the book. It's a lot going on. We're going to say select feature. We're selecting the baseline feature to grade off of. So now we've established, we've got created our grading, we set our grading group, our surface, what type of criterion right here, and now which type of grading. We're ready to pick our baseline. So now let's go in here and pick the green feature line here. And the next thing we're always going to, these ones particularly, watch your command bar or your command options. You always pick which side we're going to grade to. So in this case, we're going to pick the inside of the feature line. So let's pick in here somewhere. Okay, I picked the inside. Now the next dialog box comes up. It says, do I want to do the entire length? And yes, I do in this case. If I said no, it lets you pick an exact length you want to grade on, not the whole thing. When you see the caret answer with, or the parenthesis carets, that's the one, if you hit enter, it will select. And that's fine. What's the relative elevation I want to grade down to? -7, we'll accept that. Or you can type it in here to make you feel good. -7. Okay. And now we're doing format. So it's running through these one by one in these grading criterion. It's going through these one by one, and it'll end with this one. So we want to do grade or slope. Remember, grade's percentage. This is kind of confusing, and slope is in the ratio, always in the horizontal to the vertical, HV. So 3 to 1 would be 3 in the horizontal, 1 in the vertical, which would correspond to 33%. 33% slope is the same as 3 to 1. Very confusing for someone not in the industry, but it takes some time. So we can also type 3 for slope. That would be the same as typing 3 to 1. Enter. And this is going in the cut, the format. I'll accept slope. Sorry, I didn't do it in the right order. I gotta say enter for slope first. Now, all I have to do is hit 3 for 3 to 1 slope. Enter again. Oops. There we go. and it creates the 3-to-1 slope down at a relative elevation from this feature line. So relative to this feature line, it went down 7 feet in this inside and at a slope of 3-to-1 or 33%. That's what we just did there. And we created a new grading object, which made a surface as we went, because remember initially it said we hit OK on those ones. It made an automatic surface here, which is fine. We can also make that surface after the fact, but we chose to do it as we go. Now we're going to go to expand our creation tools and go to create infill. And now it's asking to select an area to infill. So in this one, we're going to pick the inside of this pond. Click somewhere near the center of the pond right there would be fine. It created a big grading object in the inside of that pond. So essentially it just created an infill, a grading, which was the void of this grading object, basically like the water in the pond. It didn't provide any extra points or anything. It just essentially enabled the grading group surface, for example, to extend across this open area, this pond geometry. So an infill, it can be placed in any closed area created by one or more feature lines they have to be on the same site. So have an enclosed one on the outside and then one on the inside, and it will infill it in some manner. So with everything still open and going here on my grading creation tools, let's change our criterion to grade to distance now. All right. Well, actually, before I do that, I've already created my infill. Let's hit escape. Let that accept. Give it a minute while it thinks. And now that I'm out of the infill command, that's been created. And remember, in tool space, these are being populated under here. We put them in this site. The grading groups are being created under here. Here they are. There's 2 of them created. One was an infill, one wasn't. All right. So let's go back to graded distance. And let's go to create grading. And it's asking for a feature. So we got graded distance going. We said create another grading on this same grading group. You should be seeing this little square saying select a feature again. So let's pick the same baseline feature line here, right here, boom. And now we want to pick a grading side, but in this case, let's pick the outside of the pond. So let's get in here a little closer, make sure I pick somewhere outside, left data click. And it's saying again, do I want to apply to the entire length of this pond? Yeah, they want us to do that, so accept that and hit enter. And now it's looking for a distance. So it's following this criteria along. It's going distance. Now it's going to ask for the slope after that. So it's following this in order. And at this point, you can see a prompt coming up saying, well, I could also pick my distance here graphically. But in this case, I had the default distance at 10 in my criterion here. And it's also saying if I hit enter, it will accept that. And that's fine. That's what I want. I hit enter. And now it's going to the next option, the slope, as you see here. And also it's the next one cascading in this criterion. Instead of doing slope, let's click grade, or you can click G for grade. But I prefer just to click the button, the grade out button. And in this case, we'll accept the default grade of 2%. This grades uphill at 2% in uphill fashion. Hit enter again, and it made another grading out. So it graded out even further, 10 feet at 2%, 10 feet horizontally. Basically, we just essentially made the big berm around this pond. So let's zoom in here a little bit, take our time so it doesn't crash everything. You can see our stormwater pipe going into it. We created a nice feature line that sucked into the existing surface and rose up, and we created a berm around it. Be careful with this dialog box. It can be very slow and clunky. So go into it with caution and your own peril. It looks pretty, but it's dangerous. Dangerous to crash. All right, I think I survived that one, barely, without a crash. But feel free to cascade these down to just one viewport this way if you want, or like I've said before, in the viewport configuration, put it down to one. Make sure you're on the one you want before you do that though. So going back to the grading creation tools, we got to set a target surface for this last part. So let's do that. It probably was set in the background already, but let's make sure it was. We'll hit EG, hit OK, the target surface for one of our criterion, which is grade to surface. Now, this is probably one of my most favorite ones because it's very dynamic, and it basically grades to whatever surface you want it to, and it does cut fill on its own. Set that up right here. The drop down, grade to surface, and it'll go through these steps too, which surface to target, which we established here, cut fills at what angles or slopes, and the rest is history. So essentially, we created a little 2% slight grade upward berm on the outside, but now we need to grade it back down to existing grade from the outside. So let's do that. Let's create another grading. Let's go into the upper right viewport, and it's asking for the feature. Let's create a grading off of this grading. Click that, and we'll say yes. Let's just press enter to go through all the prompts to accept all of them. We'll say yes, enter. We'll say yes to slope. We'll say yes to 3 to 1, yes to slope again, and yes to 3 to 1. And it should grade out from this berm right here to the outer edge down to the existing grade, or up to, depending. So up here it had to get in a cut scenario. Cut had to go upwards. The rest, it went into an embankment. Fill scenario went down, 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 and it filled all the way down, all the way around, back to form the rest of the pond. So that's the end of learning about your initial grading objects. We were able to do 4 or 5 different ones, which is pretty cool. 3 out of the 4 grading criterions, which we got through. And we'll move on to the end of this chapter, which is doing some basic edits on grading objects. Like I was saying before, any edit to a feature line will be translated to the updating the grading object, which will be great. That's what I was showing you on this site that I was doing all the way across to promote me having to do half as many feature lines. I made grading objects off of all the toe or lip of curbs to the top back of curbs. So half of my feature lines in this entire drawing were automated because my front feature line made my grading object update. My grading object was tied to it, and I used the grade to relative elevation function for my feature line, and I brought them up a certain small amount to my top back of curb. So going back to the 5th file, editing grading objects. So there's a couple things we can do to edit grading objects. We can use the grading editor or edit grading. The grading editor command opens the panorama. It lets you edit the criteria in a table, tabular format. The edit grading command is a purely command line interface. So let's dive into that. So we'll go back to our pond here in the upper right, and we'll click on the feature line that makes up the beginning of its baseline definition. And it's basically the inside edge of the pond berm. So all we're going to do is move this feature line, which is basically the backbone of how all these grading objects were created upon. And we're going to pick that, and we're going to move that feature line to this center point. So the grading object is recalculating based on the new shape of its baseline. So when I moved that feature line, everything moved with it on the grading objects that we did. We did the first one here, we did the second, well, which was the relative elevation going down 7 feet to make the bottom of the pond. Then we made the second one out at a small distance of 2 feet and 2% to make the berm. And then we did the final third one, which was we graded down to surface all the way around the periphery, down or up, down in the fill scenario, up in the cut scenario. So I basically just changed its baseline, changing the entire shape in one fell swoop there. And of course, since the surface was based off of it, the contours matched and updated with it as well. So being I still have the feature line selected, tell I didn't let go of it, it's still selected here in my properties. We have our feature line contextual ribbon up as well for deeper edits on the horizontal and vertical here and other things we haven't learned about yet. We're going to go to raise and lower. So this is on the edit elevations panel of the ribbon. And I picked that. You got to go down to your command bar all the time. And sometimes it doesn't hurt to have the dynamic input on, honestly. This would have been a good chapter to have it on most of the time, but I've been trying to get you to look at this command bar too, so that's good. Now we're going to specify elevation difference, and the positive going up and the negative going down, of course. And we're just going to pick -1, enter. Everything related to it's going to go down a foot, as you see, on the entire pond berm design. So the entire grading group and associated surface with it, once again updated. Now the bottom of the pond, let's say, is too low and needs to be raised up. So it's getting quite a ways down there. That's our next need. Let's continue moving on by hitting escape. We have nothing in our selection set, no selection. And now we'll go back to doing, instead of editing the grading with the feature line only, we're going to go to the modify tab, not the home tab here, but we're going to go to modify. This is how you create gradings, feature lines, but we're going to go to modify. We're going to go to grading, new one here. And we're going to have a contextual ribbon stay up here. So pay attention to what's up there. So here we can edit the grading here, or the grading editor, edit what's criteria inside of it, or delete it outright, and various other things. But we're going to go to grading editor, and this opens up a panorama. First, we need to pick a point in the grading. Let's just pick a point inside the embankment of the pond. So somewhere in here. Actually, don't quite do that yet. So wherever you're hovering over, you can see it grabs this grading. If you hover there, this grading. This is the interior, the berm, and then the embankment on the outside. So in this case, we want to edit the inside here. So see that this is selected with this kind of thickening of the lines, however you want to see it. You can see it in the 3D as well. Let's select that point. Now your panorama comes up to edit this previously made grading that's already been made. So we don't want to have to recreate it all the time. And we can change things like the relative elevation we did it at, and we'll say -6. It'll come up a foot, raised up a little bit. You can edit other things too, like the slope it does. I'll leave that alone. Basically, we just raise the pond bottom a foot is all. So let's cascade this down for the moment. And on the grading tab of the ribbon, since we're still in it, we'll click edit grading this time, not the grading editor, what's inside of it. You can also get to a lot of this stuff by hovering on it and right-clicking. Picking it, right-clicking. You can delete the grading, go to the grading properties, edit its style, change a few things there. I prefer the ribbon a little more. It's a little more intuitive with these bad boys. They're not that well understood. So the ribbon has a few more options, I would say. So let's pick the grading object again so we can get the ribbon back in case you lost your ribbon. Pick these little diamonds is one way inside of them. Or if you hit escape and pick the sides like this where it grades, that works too. Just pick anything that you can graphically to get this contextual ribbon up. We'll hit edit grading this time. In this case, I already kind of picked an area in the top of the berm. I did 2 feet last time. This time I'm going to say 12. Hit enter. And let's just accept the previous settings. There, 2%. And the berm will get huge. So I made my berm 12 feet wide. I was able to edit the grading after the fact. And there we go. The grading group and surface update to accommodate the wider berm. The pond model now reflects a bigger berm. That's how we end the chapter on page 360. And remember, you can go into these, pick the grading and go into these tools up here, work pretty good. So edit grading here. Maybe if I pick in here, let's try to edit this grading on the outside. Actually, that one will not do. Let's pick this grading here. Just pick it. And let's do edit grading this way. And we're able to update the grading I did in the outside to the slope, to the, to the existing ground. So let's do this one at we'll accept slope. And I'm going to say I want it to go out at a more shallow angle, 5:1. Slope, 5:1. And it should do that shortly. So my slope gets wider, shoots out in the fill condition and in the uphill cut condition. So there I'm editing all my gradings little by little. Here it just doesn't know what to do because it can't fit a 5:1 in this short amount of time. So gradings are only as smart as you input things too, but that just shows you if you select them, you can edit them as you go with your feature line baselines. That's the end of chapter 17. That was a tough, long one.